Drew Pierce here. I'm a clinician. I currently reside in Utah, Salt Lake City area, and I've been asked to, do a PowerPoint presentation on a clinical model that I developed for the purpose of helping patients out. I've developed and tested this clinical model over the years, and am very pleased with the results, and I wanted to share it with you. This is an experiential presentation in that as a clinician or treatment center, clinical director, or even an end user, it's an experiential presentation in that you'll experience the content in much the same way that your patients would when exposed to it. Something to be mindful about as we go along. Now, field-based belief systems have played out in popular books like The Secret or The Law of Attraction over the past few decades, yet were not formalized until a model reflecting those principles was developed by Dr. Joe Dispenza within the past decade out of necessity, inspired by a spinal injury that he sustained. The centerpiece of his model is essentially placebo effect, or mind over matter. The idea being that our unquestioned beliefs about who we are have everything to do with our identity, what we believe is possible for us as such, and thus our related thoughts and our decisions. His book, Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself, outlines this model. And upon reading it, I thought, wow, this is great. I thought it could be applied toward healing addiction, which isn't nearly as complicated as spinal repair. And what I found is that when applied, a field-based change model changes patients' beliefs about who they are and what is possible for them experientially, a necessity to ensuring long-term results. So how is this done? Let's take a look at two principles underlying Dispenza's field-based change model in his own words. Number one is the need for a clear, compelling vision for the future. And number two, the need to overcome psychoneuroimmunological homeostasis, or in words that I can pronounce, the need to overcome the body's role in perpetuating the mental, emotional, and behavioral status quo, an internal barrier to the change process that becomes a future asset in maintaining the authentic identity that we hope to recover throughout the treatment episode, utilizing my adaptation of the field-based change model. Let's have a listen to his overview.
How many people believe in the idea that the way you think has some effect on your life, that your thoughts are intimately connected to your future? So your thoughts in some way create your reality. You believe that? So how many people in this audience have a clear vision of their future? You see, you think 60 to 70,000 thoughts in one day. Out of those 60 to 70,000 thoughts that you think in one day, 90% of those thoughts are the same thoughts as the day before. So if you believe that your thoughts somehow are connected to your life, then the same thoughts always lead to the same choices. The same choices always lead to the same behaviors. The same behaviors create the same experiences, and the same experiences produce the same emotions. And those very same emotions drive the very same thoughts. And your biology, your neurocircuitry, your neurochemistry, your neurohormones, And even your genetic expression is equal to how you think, how you act, and how you feel. And how you think, how you act, and how you feel is called your personality. And your personality creates your personal reality. That's it. So then, if you wanted to create a new personal reality, a new life, then you would have to start thinking about what you've been thinking about and change it. You would have to become aware of your unconscious thoughts and observe them. You would have to pay attention to your automatic habits and behaviors and modify them. And you would have to look at the emotions you live by every single day that are connected to your past and decide if those emotions belong in your future. You see, most people try to create a new personal reality as the same personality, and it doesn't work. You literally have to become someone else. So your brain is organized to reflect everything you know in your life. Your brain is a record of the past. It's an artifact of all the things you've learned and experienced to this moment. So if you wake up every morning and get out of bed on the same side, shut the alarm clock off with the same finger, shuffle into the bathroom and use the toilet like you always do, go and get a cup of coffee and drink coffee out of your favorite mug, then get in the shower and wash yourself off in the same routine way, drive to work, get to work, see the same people that push the same emotional buttons, do the same things that you've memorized and do so well, then hurry up and go home, and hurry up and check your emails, and hurry up and check your Facebook, then hurry up and go to bed. Here's my question. Did your brain change at all that day? We could say that you were thinking the same thoughts, performing the same unconscious actions, living by the same emotions, but secretly expecting your life to change. So there's a principle in neuroscience. And the principle says, nerve cells that fire together wire together. So if you're thinking the same thoughts, making the same choices, demonstrating the same behaviors, reproducing the same experiences that stamp the same networks of neurons into the same patterns, and then produce the same emotions, you're going to hardwire your brain into a very finite signature. Because as you fire and wire the same circuits in the same way, those circuits begin to become more connected. And by the time you're 35 years old, this is science now, we become a set of memorized behaviors, unconscious habits, automatic emotional reactions, beliefs and perceptions, and even attitudes that function just like a computer program. And if you do something over and over and over again, the repetition of those actions over time conditions your body to know how to do it well better than your mind. And a habit is when your body knows better than your mind, where you've done something so many times that the body now knows how to do it better than the brain. And so 95% of most people's behaviors, attitudes, thoughts, beliefs, emotional reactions are subconscious programs. So why is that important? Because you're here this week to learn new information. And every time you learn something new, you make new connections in your brain. That's what learning is. Learning is forging new synaptic connections. Physical evidence as a result of your interaction in the environment and the footprints of consciousness It's called learning, making new connections. And the Nobel Prize laureate Kandel in the year 2000 found that when people learned one bit of information, they doubled the number of connections in their brain from 1,300 connections to 2,600 connections. But if they didn't review that information, if they couldn't repeat it, if they couldn't remember it, those circuits pruned apart in hours or days. So if learning is making new synaptic connections, then remembering is maintaining and sustaining those connections. And you are here this week to learn vital information about creating a future and be defined by a vision of the future instead of the memories of the past. Because if you are not defined by some vision that is bigger than you, and you are not passionate about that vision, then you're left with the old hardware of the past in your brain, and you will be predictable in your life. So would you agree then? New thoughts, new information should lead to new choices. New choices should lead to new behaviors. And new behaviors should create new experiences. And new experiences should produce new emotions. And those new emotions should drive new thoughts. And that's called evolution. So if your brain is a record of the past, and you don't have a vision of the future, then you are living in the past. And you will never arrive at that new future. So then if you wake up in the morning and you are not being defined by a vision that's bigger than you, and it doesn't get you out of bed and inspire you into possibility, and you get up living from the old hardware of the past and the old emotions stored in your body, do you know what's going to happen to you? You're going to wake up and you're going to open your eyes and you're going to see the same people and go to the same places and do the exact same thing at the exact same time. And the moment you open your eyes, all of a sudden now, it's your external environment that's controlling how you think and feel. Because you have a neurological network in your brain for every person you know, every place that you go, everything that you own, everything that you do. And the moment you open your eyes and you see the same people and go to the same places and do the exact same thing at the exact same time, it's your external environment that's turning on different circuits in your brain, causing you to think equal to everything that you know. And you told me you believe that your thoughts have something to do with your destiny. And as long as you're thinking equal to your environment, you keep creating the same life. To change, to truly change, is to think greater than your environment. To think greater than the circumstances in your life. To think greater than the conditions in your world. And every great person in history knew this. Whether it was Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, the Wright brothers, Joan of Arc. They all had a vision. Couldn't see it, couldn't smell it, couldn't taste it, couldn't feel it, but it was alive in their mind. It was so alive in their mind that they began to live as if that future reality was happening in the present moment. And so the moment you stop making the same choices that you always make, get ready, because it's going to be uncomfortable. And that's the moment you are heading towards the new self. And we call it stepping into the river of change. But now, remember, 95% of who you are is your body as the mind. You know, you've done something enough times that your body does it better than your brain. So you may actually complain unconsciously, because your body does it all the time. And all of a sudden you say, no complaining, no more blaming, no more feeling sorry for myself, no more talking about other people, I'm going to stop. You know what happens, don't you? the body starts sending signals to the brain. The body's been conditioned that way. And all of a sudden, you start hearing the thoughts in your head that say, why don't you start tomorrow? Tomorrow's a better day. This is too hard for me, I can't change. Something's wrong with me, it's my mother's fault. It's my ex-husband's fault. It's my ex-wife's fault. I'm this way because of this event. Or the most important one, this doesn't feel right. And the moment you respond to that thought as if it's true, that thought leads to the same choice, which leads to the same behavior, that creates the same experience, that produces the same emotion, and the person says, this feels right. That feels familiar. Going from the old self to the new self, stepping into that void, stepping into that uncertainty, is the biological, the neurological, the chemical, the hormonal, genetic death of the old self. And people will say to us, well, in that unknown, I can't predict my life or my future. And we always say the same thing to them. The best way to predict your future is to create it, not from the known, but from the unknown. And when you and I get comfortable in the place of the unknown, that's where the magic happens. And it never happens in the known.
Inspiring, right? However, in order to be utilized with our population, we need to address the underlying pathology that impairs our patient's ability to even conjure an image of a credible aspirational vision. Barriers which I've found to have most often originated in the family of origin were then reinforced through adulthood in familiar adult relationships, and finally were often further exacerbated throughout their active addiction. Things like paralyzing shame, or in Ernie Larson's words, the absolute belief that they do not deserve anything good. Nothing at all. Terrifying fear of abandonment, causing repression of the true self in favor of attachment to dysfunctional familiar people in their inner circle, relationships informed by self-esteem. This fear of abandonment and change can definitely be paralyzing, and it's a barrier that is not unique to addiction, but is certainly prevalent. Fear of change, of course, connected to abandonment, the idea that if I change, everyone in my life is going to leave me. Failing to take into account that old dysfunctional relationships will soon be replaced by healthy ones. Incredibly low self-efficacy or learned helplessness. The ingrained belief that somehow past performance guarantees future results, leading to hopelessness. Even stockbrokers are required to state past performance does not guarantee future results. This fact will serve not as a warning to our patients, but in their case as a message of hope as they move through the UTR change process. And of course, physiological damage to the brain from chronic addiction contributes to patients' learned helplessness in the form of overly robust dopaminergic pathways between the nucleus accumbens and ventral tegmental areas that we all learned about in grad school, leading to strong cravings and addictive behaviors and thoughts that perpetuate the status quo both unconsciously and consciously. In addition, chronic substance-induced reduced density and functionality of frontal cortex structures, including the anterior cingulate cortex, impairs patients' ability to accurately self-assess, Damage to the orbitofrontal cortex results in misvaluation or a inverted values hierarchy where healthy self-care behavior becomes supplanted by habituated substance-seeking thoughts and behaviors. Reduced function in the insular cortex impairs patients' ability to connect the dots between their behaviors and their consequences and to accurately empathize with loved ones. So all these factors conspire against our patients' ability to aspire wholeheartedly and are thoroughly addressed in the clinical model that I've developed. My clinical model, which I've coined the Unified Theory of Recovery, or UTR, was adapted to overcome the barriers that are unique to the addicted and those in early recovery. There are 5 primary overlays to my change model. I call them overlays because although they're generally introduced linearly, in much the same manner being presented today, they are woven together and work concurrently throughout the patient's treatment episode. The handout at the end of this presentation shows how all the model's concepts are interlaced, and thus the name, the Unified Theory of Recovery. So the first overlay is basic stage 1 recovery. It involves implementing traditional recovery methods such as psychoeducation on addiction, resolving cognitive distortions like control fallacy, polarized thinking, minimization, catastrophizing, etc., and facilitating clients' ability to join the recovery community by way of mutual support groups like AA, NA, CODA, Smart Recovery, whatever's appropriate for them, as well as addressing any mental health issues fueling addictions like mood disorders, OCD, anxiety, and so on. Of course, stage 2 recovery is part of the traditional recovery methodology. It involves what I call the authentication process, where we help patients recover their true self, which was usually abandoned as a survival mechanism early on in their development in order to cope with environmental factors like dysfunctional family of origin, which may have included adverse childhood experiences such as incarceration, harsh judgmentalism and shaming by their parents, neglect, family addiction, abuse, trauma, etc. The third overlay is the magic wand thought experiment. It's a core aspect of the UTR model, where we hypothetically give the patient a magic wand, and then they describe in excruciating detail what both they and their world would be like, both descriptively and experientially, if time and money were no object. Essentially, heaven on earth. This is that vision to which Dispenza refers in his previous video. And fourth, we provide education on the science behind the field-based change model, some of which we'll cover in a minute. That's the quantum physics, quantum mechanics field, quantum field theory, and its application. Finally, we pull everything together for the doing aspect of the model, which is engaging in quantum-guided meditations, of which many are available on Amazon and YouTube, among other resources. So, Dispenza pointed out that habituation of behaviors, mindsets, and attitudes over time, in our case those associated with addiction, makes it such that our bodies know how to do these things, addictive behaviors and thoughts in our case, better than the mind, making the body what he calls the unconscious mind. Remember, 95% of your thoughts are the same as yesterday's. The human body has 7 times more channels going into the brain from the body then vice versa. These are called interoceptive channels. The body's mere volume, in light of these additional channels going into the brain as opposed to coming out, overpowers thought in early recovery. So repetition until new concepts are internalized becomes paramount. Ultimately, the body seeks homeostasis. This is why when you go to the gym January 1st and it's empty by February 1st, the mind decides it wants to become more fit, but without repetition of this thought process, the body ultimately wins that argument by sending up signals that want to maintain the old status quo. This is also why acute care models tend to fail without long-term aftercare. Some examples of this psychoneuroimmunology and the interoceptive dynamics between the body and the mind might be, the most obvious one would be an alcoholic who decides he wants to quit drinking. He or she decides to quit drinking in their head, right? They stop for a few hours or maybe a day, and then all their body, which has been conditioned by possibly years of drinking, has a certain chemical composition, and it sends hormones and messenger hormones up to the brain, which is the best way to think of it. And it affects our unconscious thoughts, and then eventually our conscious thoughts, and then eventually our overt behaviors. The alcoholic goes to the liquor store, gets some booze, homeostasis is restored. What's interesting about this is that when we think about, we have an embodied identity as people in addiction, our patients do, that has a lot of shame involved. And shame and other moods, it's simply a chemical composition in the brain, right? It involves peptides and hormones, cortisol and things like that. And so when we decide that we want to change from being a substance user or an addict, even if it's a behavioral addiction like gambling, sex, shopping, etc., this battle with homeostasis, the desire to maintain the status quo, initially is our enemy. But again, with repetition and determination and a good support system, a support network, we can succeed. At that point, over time, we basically develop and embody a new identity, which has nothing to do with our old former identity and all the emotions that are embodied that come with it. So once change is fully internalized over time, that homeostasis works in our favor, sustaining that change and a new identity, in the case of addiction, as a non-user or as a former user. So I'd like to go over now how I help patients develop a compelling vision for their future that has substance, depth, and emotion built into it. Again, this is one of the overlays of this clinical model. After providing psychoeducation on psychoneuroimmunology, or the mind-body connection, Dispenza refers to, in his previous video that we watched, where the body becomes the unconscious mind. I lay out the process, usually drawing it out on the ink board as shown here, so that patients may gain a visual overview of what it is that they're attempting to accomplish. The magic wand thought experiment is essentially a supersized, solution-focused therapeutic intervention that we might employ when a patient complains about how things are, and we ask, well, how would you like them to be? When done properly, this exercise reveals the aforementioned pathology, such as shame, learned helplessness, trauma, and low self-esteem, which would serve as barriers to their progress, which we will help them to overcome throughout the therapeutic episode. So this step, in addition to building a vision, obviously serves multiple purposes. It reveals pathology. This process also gives them and us focus, because when patients know what they do want, they also gain clarity as to 359 degrees of what they don't want, which helps them to gain insight into what is not important nor useful to their recovery process, streamlining their process as they apply this principle. Finally, patients engaged in this intervention tend to fully buy into the process because, possibly for the first time ever, it is their vision that they are working toward and nobody else's. This is not a people-pleasing activity. This is a self-realization activity. So this slide provides a little more detail as to this aspect of the UTR model. On the left are the dimensions I have patients flesh out in terms of what they really want if they were handed a magic wand. On the right, the fourth dimension, if you will, of their 4D vision involves the emotions they will experience when they mentally occupy their ideal reality. The capstone experience of the magic wand thought experiment entails a letter from the patient's future self, who is residing in their idealized world, to their present self in the first person. This letter needs to be emotionally believable to the point that anyone reading it can accurately empathize with the patient's reality as much as the patient themselves. So that's the first part of the magic wand thought experiment. Step B, once the vision is complete, I move on to the values exercise, where we ask the patient, what kind of values does your idealized self possess? I have a list of about 400 values from which to choose. After selecting about 20 of them, I have them pare that list down to 10, as there are normally overlaps in many of the values in their initial pass. Then, once they're pared down to 10, we rank them, creating a hierarchy from most important to least most important. They're all very important for the patients. For the sake of expediency here, I used my own hierarchy and bolded my aspirational values, those being ones that I either never had or lost when I abandoned my true self in favor of attachment or to protect my addiction along the way. The others I always possessed to some degree over the years, but still ascribe to. Authenticity will always be the first value, no matter what, as it is necessary in asserting the stage 2 true self that is recovered during this authentication process. Finally, step 3. In the final step, the patient identifies tangible experiences that are aligned with their highest values, that their idealized self may have at some point in the future or even now. This part of the exercise creates hope for the future. It creates happiness in the present and proves to patients that they don't have to wait until their vision is fully realized in order to be happy. If they can get 70, 80% of the way there in a relatively short period of time simply by having gone through this exercise, that's going to take away a lot of fuel for the desire to self-medicate. The overriding principle being that living a life that's aligned with our highest values creates happiness and decreases stress, and again, thus fuel for the desire to self-medicate. During the remainder of the treatment episode, we look for discrepancy between the identification of and the implementation of these experiences, and we address that discrepancy. So that's the magic wand thought experiment. Once that's done, we must help patients overcome the learned helplessness that they've acquired over sometimes decades of addiction and family dysfunction by explaining the science that enables this type of change. The science portion of the UTR therapeutic episode is intended to remove all doubt in patients' belief in their ability to occupy the idealized self and reality that they've defined in their magic wand thought experiment. In order to do this, it's useful to get them to question their worldview. And quantum mechanics is one of the best ways to do that for anybody, so that their old limiting belief systems can be replaced with one that is both truly accurate and conducive to profound fundamental change of identity. In other words, their unquestioned beliefs about who they truly are and what's possible for them in a short period of time. I like to say that a person in early recovery is someone with an identity crisis having an identity crisis. And that is certainly true in the case of my patients. So let's have a quick look at what you'd call a reductionistic perspective of the universe as supported by pretty much every physicist that's delved deeply in the subject. It's a matter of going down to levels in terms of scope. We could start with human beings and everything in the universe. In the case of human beings, we're made up of tissues which are made up of molecules, whether they're bone tissues or brain tissues, nerve tissues. Those tissues are ultimately made up of atoms, which are made up of subatomic particles, quarks and electrons, if you want to be specific. And then the quarks and electrons are derived from immaterial fields from which everything is derived, really, as a result. And the fields consist of energy, and they're structurally fundamental to all of reality, all of it. And then possibly beneath that level is information, which governs field behavior and is fundamental. It's written into the nature of everything. So that's sort of a regressive approach that we're working with when we describe our conception of reality. I like this slide. This is a good place to start. It refers to particle theory. Over a century or so, particle theory, exemplified here, worked well for physicists at explaining many things, but was never able to account for things like consciousness, awareness, or the ghost in the machine, if you will. Scientists felt no need to account for such subjective nonsense as the concept of self-awareness, for instance, or love, as science is purely objective, or so they claimed. Particle theory explained nearly all observable phenomena until we eventually developed better and better tools to explore the nature of reality below the subatomic level. It's important for our purposes to note that all physical matter, you, me, everything, is composed of three fundamental particles: quarks and electrons. But the quarks, there's two kinds of quarks for some reason, what's called an up quark and a down quark. I guess they ran out of fancy words for them. Up quarks, down quarks, those are what make up the protons and neutrons of an atom, the nucleus. And then electrons are what flies around that we all learned about back in grade school physics class. Some interesting fact, though, about quarks and electrons is the idea of empty space. And if to give you an idea of what the architecture of an atom really looks like, the picture on the left, the atom on the left of the screen, is not written to scale. If you blew up the nucleus of, let's say, a hydrogen atom to the size of a golf ball, that cloud of possibility, that sphere of possibility where the electron would be flying around that golf ball size nucleus, would be 3 miles across. The rest of it is empty space. And of course, quantum field theory is all about what is in that empty space. It's not really empty. To put it another way, if you took out all the space from between all the atoms of every human being on the planet, all 7 billion people, you'd end up with a piece of matter about the size of a sugar cube. If you took all of the empty space out from between all the atoms comprising all the cement and steel in the Empire State Building, you'd have something the size of a tiny grain of dried up rice, but it would weigh, millions of tons. So at this level, really at any level, we're barely more than holograms. It's just that we're held together by field forces that we'll be covering in a minute. But it's an important concept. I just wanted to convey that. So what happens, though, when we deal with all this empty space and we learn about fields, which we're going to go into a little bit greater detail, it also helps to understand what the practical implications of these fields and this energy is. Consciousness itself, it turns out, is a field. And conscious energy, directed energy, has a material impact on creating material reality. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's watch this short video that talks about how we discovered that we are, in fact, one with everything else around us, and that our conscious awareness of everything creates our own reality. Here we go.
And here we are, the granddaddy of all quantum weirdness, the infamous double slit experiment. To understand this experiment, we first need to see how particles, or little balls of matter, act. If we randomly shoot a small object, say a marble, at the screen, we see a pattern on the back wall where they went through the slit and hit. Now, if we add a second slit, we would expect to see a second band duplicated to the right. Now, let's look at waves. The waves hit the slit and radiate out, striking the back wall with the most intensity directly in line with the slit. The line of brightness on the back screen shows that intensity. This is similar to the line the marbles make. But when we add the second slit, something different happens. If the top of one wave meets the bottom of another wave, they cancel each other out. So now there is an interference pattern on the back wall. Places where the two tops meet are the highest intensity, the bright lines, and where they cancel, there is nothing. So, when we throw things, that is, matter, through two slits, we get this, two bands of hits. And with waves, we get an interference pattern of many bands. Good so far. Now, let's go quantum. An electron is a tiny, tiny bit of matter, like a tiny marble. Let's fire a stream through one slit. It behaves just like the marble, a single band. So, if we shoot these tiny bits through two slits, we should get, like the marbles, two bands. What? An interference pattern! We fired electrons, tiny bits of matter through. But we get a pattern like waves, not like little marbles. How? How could pieces of matter create an interference pattern like a wave? It doesn't make sense. But physicists are clever. They thought, maybe those little balls are bouncing off each other and creating that pattern. So, they decide to shoot electrons through one at a time. There is no way they can interfere with each other. But after an hour of this, the same interference pattern is seen to emerge. The conclusion is inescapable. The single electron leaves as a particle, becomes a wave of potentials, goes through both slits, and interferes with itself to hit the wall like a particle. But mathematically, it's even stranger. It goes through both slits and it goes through neither. And it goes through just one and it goes through just the other. All of these possibilities are in superposition with each other. But physicists were completely baffled by this. So they decided to peek and see which slit it actually goes through. They put a measuring device by one slit to see which one it went through and let it fly. But the quantum world is far more mysterious than they could have imagined. When they observed, the electron went back to behaving like a little marble. It produced a pattern of two bands, not an interference pattern of many. The very act of measuring or observing which slit it went through meant it only went through one, not both. The electron decided to act differently, as though it was aware it was being watched. And it was here that physicists stepped forever into the strange, netherworld of quantum events. What is matter? Marbles or waves? And waves of what? And what does an observer have to do with any of this? The observer collapsed the wave function simply by observing.
Okay, so that's pretty fascinating, right? If we were to summarize, we would have to say that in the absence of a consciousness or an observer, somebody with knowledge of the system, all possibilities exist. There is no concrete reality. Until the observer is engaged in the process. So this baffled people, understandably, right? But this is where quantum field theory explains the intersection of consciousness and material reality. And we're going to get down to the nuts and bolts of that in a minute. But the mistake that people were making, scientists were making when they did the double slit experiment, was the reason they were confused is because they didn't realize that both the system, the electron gun, the electrons, then all the space in between the apparatus, and themselves were in fact part and parcel of the exact same field system. In other words, that's where consciousness plays a role. It actually has a material impact on the outcome and the state of that system. So when we add consciousness, we coalesce reality from all the infinite possibilities into our own local reality. So if we don't observe or know which path the electron took through the slits, then the system is in a state of what he called superposition, where all possible realities exist simultaneously, resulting in an interference pattern, reflecting that the electron arguably went through both, or neither, or one or the other, we simply don't know, of the slits. But if we know which path the electron takes, it always discharges its energy in a clump pattern on that screen. So again, our knowledge of the system impacts its state of being by virtue of the fact that our consciousness is inextricably connected with the system. When you add consciousness, reality coalesces into whatever it is, creating a local reality, frankly, for everybody. So we get a clue from this upcoming look at the nature of reality on a level even more fundamental than subatomic particles, again, from the level from which those particles are created, fields. Don't get overwhelmed by every detail of this video, particularly any math or equations. Let's have a look at fields
This is a computer simulation of empty space. All the bubbles that you see popping and bursting are perturbations of empty space. Particles are constantly being created and destroyed in this emptiness.
This isn't a perfect
These particles
vacuum.
are really excitations of fields that pervade all of space. What you can see in the world around you are excitations of these fields. In fact, all you can see is really only the excitations of 4 of the fields. You can see photons or light, which are vibrations in the electromagnetic field. Electrons are vibrations in the electron field. Up quarks and down quarks make up the protons and neutrons in the nucleus of all atoms. They are vibrations in the up quark field and down quark field, respectively. Amazingly, everything that you can see around you, your phone, your desk, flowers and trees, the earth below your feet, everything is composed of just these 4 fields. But there are more than just these 4 fields. In fact, everything that we designated as particles in the standard model, the best theory of physics we have, are really excitations or vibrations of their own fields. The total number of fields would be 17, including the Higgs field. Note that space-time itself is thought to be a field, but so far has not been able to be incorporated in quantum field theory. It would be the 18th field. All the so-called particles are really waves. And when I say wave, I don't mean a wave like an ocean wave. The 2D models are just a visual aid, but the waves would actually be 3-dimensional. Can you see any of these fields? Not really, but you can kind of get an idea by putting a magnet together with some metal filings. The lines that you see are really the magnetic field lines changing due to the magnet. Another way to visualize field.
So Niels Bohr, the Dutch physicist, summed it up best when he stated, "Everything we think of as real is made up of that which cannot be considered real." Consciousness itself, by the way, is not material but immaterial, just like the fields that were illustrated in the video. Going back to the double slit experiment, to explain how directed consciousness affects the state of the electron gun, the slit, and the screen system, again, what physicists at the time failed to realize was that the observer of the experiment and the system itself are not in fact separate from each other, because they are nothing more than physical expressions of the exact same 3 fields that comprise both the apparatus and the observer. So it's not surprising that they are enmeshed with each other. When our patients realize and internalize this fact, we have paved the way for them to believe that they are in fact capable of creating not only their own identity, but their own reality and thus their own future. And the implications of this understanding on their part cannot be overstated. So, again, the substrate of the entire universe are these continuous fields consisting of only energy and information, as shown in this table, that span all of space-time. Every atom in the periodic table is made up solely of up quarks and down quarks and electrons derivative of those 3 fields. Energized scalar fields, which are responsible for the particles, interact with the Higgs field, converting that immaterial energy into the particles associated with their respective fields. Vector fields, the orange column, govern the behavior of the subatomic particles so that they don't just fly off all willy-nilly, which then enables the formation of atom nuclei, atoms, molecules, and everything and everybody else. So the world as we know it would not exist without the mathematical rules that are written into the 17 unified fields. Consciousness, or directed energy, possessed by any sentient being, coalesces immaterial possibility into material reality by way of this mechanism and action. Again, when Niels Bohr explained this, Einstein stated, "Well, I like to think that the moon is there when I'm not looking at it." According to every experiment done on the matter, Einstein was proven wrong. This, of course, does open the possibility of some higher consciousness, perhaps keeping an eye on those things to which we are not paying attention. But as we are literally derivative of the system that we propose to be analyzing, objectivity is impossible. Instead, subjective consciousness, supported by circumstantial evidence, is the best that we can possibly do given the circumstances. And again, one could argue that the information that's woven into these fields is the true foundation of reality, which would be yet another argument in favor of some sort of divine intelligence, perhaps an author of the algorithm that makes the fields and the physics associated with them possible. How about some clinical applications for this science? In the double-slit experiment video, Dr. Quantum stated that in the absence of observation, mathematically speaking, all possible realities regarding the state of the unobserved electron in that case exist simultaneously in superposition until a conscious observer imposes their awareness on the system, collapsing it into a single reality. One significant implication for superposition comes in terms of instilling hope and self-efficacy in patients. The fact that directed consciousness determines our reality puts us in the unique position of becoming co-gods, creating our reality as we go along. The responsibility as co-creators of reality, by virtue of how we direct our thoughts, forces us to be diligent about rooting out cognitive distortions and to be mindful about how unconscious factors inform our conscious thoughts. This level of self-reflection, thinking about what we're thinking about, is helpful to expedite the depth and rate of our patient's recovery process utilizing this model. Patients also realize that the finite signature moving forward of their old self no longer impairs their future possibilities. All clinical benefits of internalization of the science behind the UTR field-based change model are coming to life with our patients at this point. Now, we're almost finished. Let's take a look at Dr. Dispenza's final point with an eye toward how your own exposure to this new material is forming your neural connections in exactly the same way he is about to illustrate. Remember, the fields, or directed conscious energy, are fundamental to the entire change process. This occurs within our brains because our brains are comprised of brain matter, which are comprised also of neurons, which are comprised of neuron molecules, which are comprised of atoms, which are comprised of electrons and up quarks and down quarks, all of which are inhabited by 99.999999% empty space, which isn't really empty. Consciousness occupies that space, and the fields. What you're about to see is happening to you right now. And this is also what happens to your patients when you're working with them. This is why talk therapy works. Understanding what you're about to see and getting along with the science and getting our patients to understand and internalize it yields significant clinical benefits. And I do show this part of the presentation to all my patients. And to the extent that I'm able to get them to internalize it, our work proceeds at an amazing pace.
I'll stop right after this slide. Learning is making new synaptic connections. Every time you learn something new, this is what's happening in your brain, geniuses. If you learned one bit of information today, your brain did this. Boom. That's learning. Physical evidence as a result of your interaction in the environment. Every time you learn something in your brain, there's a physical change that takes place, and learning is making new connections. Are you with me? This is how fast it happens, too. That's learning. If you learn anything this week, you've made a footprint. If learning is making new synaptic connections, then if you keep firing the same thoughts over and over again, you're going to wire them in your brain. So then if learning is making new synaptic connections, then remembering is maintaining them. And all of a sudden, they develop a long-term relationship. And just like any relationship, the more you communicate, the more they connect. And neurons are exactly the same way. Now, as you begin to learn information, neurons tend to assemble themselves into networks, or what's called neural networks. And neural networks are just gangs of neurons that have fired and wired together to form a community of neurosynaptic connections that's related to a thought, a skill, a habit, a behavior, a concept. And neural networks are automatic programs. You have a neural network to brush your teeth, to put on makeup, to speak a language, to walk. All of a sudden, those neurons then form a hardware circuitry, but if you keep repeating it, the hardware becomes a software program and it becomes automatic. So then, you want to see a thought? Watch. Boom, there's a thought. Right there. Watch again. Boom, that's a thought. You generate more electrical impulses in your brain in one day than all the cell phones on the planet put together. And it's not coming from the candy bar you just ate. You are connected to a greater field. So then,
if we follow the circumstantial breadcrumbs leading to the possibility of some sort of divine author of the algorithm that's governing the dynamics of the unified field, whose properties that science has irrefutably proven, then we're able to put that theory to the test, which is exactly what I and my patients have done over the course of the last few years with consistent results. What we have found is that the experiential interplay between what I simply call the universe on one hand and the UTR practitioner, or our patients, on the other, has resolved spiritual skepticism, as quantum-guided meditations that are based upon patients' magic wand thought experiment have invariably yielded synchronistic feedback from the universe without exception. We don't have time to cover quantum entanglement here, but a UTR practitioner would probably say that in a focused meditative state, we're essentially reaching across time and space, connecting with the entangled version of our idealized self, whose electromagnetic signature is congruent with that of our current most authentic self. Our authenticity makes us better receivers of that signal, thus the authentication process, enabling the universe to work more efficiently in merging our present self with that idealized self, coalescing it from all of the possibilities, moving us closer to that reality. There are many guided quantum meditations on the market today, and I have designed many custom ones in my recording studio that reflect patients' magic wand thought experiments. This is really the doing part of the unified theory of recovery. Once the principles are laid out, and as with any recovery program, internalization and continuity are critical in maintaining the gains that we've made as we go along. The clinical benefits of the unified theory of recovery, the spirituality aspect, improve self-awareness, motivation to resolve our cognitive distortions. Remember, we get what we think about. Every good experience you ever probably had started as a thought at one point, and probably so did nearly every bad experience. If it wasn't your thought, it was someone else's, right? This clinical model and the science behind it instills hope because of the superposition of all possible realities. It creates focus. It gives our patients something hopeful to look forward to in the form of the magic wand thought experiment. Metacognition in itself is a stress-reducing activity, creating a degree of separation between our thoughts and ourselves with a capital S as the conscious observer of our thoughts. Reduces fuel for the desire to self-medicate. This clinical model is beneficial to both the devout and the spiritually skeptical in that it explains the mechanism behind the human/higher power relationship, if you will. It overcomes shame because superposition not only works in a forward direction, but all possible pasts exist simultaneously. It is only the here and now that is coalesced into a concrete reality. Everything else moving forward is simply anticipation. Everything looking backward is pointless. And if our past is the past timeline that we most strongly relate to is filled with shame, it's one of an infinite number of pasts, at least according to the math. So why become fixated on the most shameful one that we can imagine? This clinical model is non-judgmental. It's not about a guy sitting on a throne with a robe telling you what you can and can't do in order to engage in spirituality. Therefore, it doesn't activate the righting or reflex, and it does not activate the ego against it. It improves self-efficacy, our belief that we can change simply by knowledge of how things work. It's more powerful than talk therapy because it's actually experiential. As people engage in the process and change their neural wiring as a result of occupying mentally that version of themselves that they've created in their magic wand thought experiment, when they're finished with the meditation, their brain literally more closely resembles that of that idealized version of themselves, necessarily. And of course, that necessarily affects their sense of possibilities. It affects their self-perception and all the implications of becoming, basically adopting a new identity, that with a brain that resembles something more closely their idealized version of themselves. They perceive things different. It's a different perceptual vantage point, which is what we want when we have a different identity. Understanding this clinical model resolves things like loneliness and isolation. Loneliness is one of the top two triggering factors in relapse, next to boredom. And when we understand that we're literally all just material expressions of the exact same unified field system, we understand that we are all connected. We're literally derived of the same stuff. The model provides a compelling circumstantial argument for a higher power. If nothing else, the idea of whose consciousness is watching that stuff that we're not, right? The program aligns with 12-step programs, enhancing steps 2, 3, and 11. The book that I wrote, entitled Resolving Spiritual Skepticism and Recovery, outlines this clinical model and has 36 hours of supporting video content. It's not me talking, it's documentaries, TED Talks, things that bring the data to life. Some of the videos that we saw in this particular presentation are part of the video media vault that accompanies my book that came out in 2021 on O'Leary Publishing, entitled, again, Resolving Spiritual Skepticism in Recovery by Andrew G. Pierce, available on Amazon. And finally, the science behind this clinical model is irrefutable. Every experiment ever done to either affirm or disconfirm it has validated quantum field theory. There are some benefits for clinicians to adopt this model. By the way, the left-hand side of the screen is sort of a visual representation of all the different aspects of traditional recovery and quantum field theory that are connected together. It's pretty interesting if you get a chance to blow that up. But some of the clinical benefits, there's significant patient buy-in. Again, this is their vision that they're pursuing, possibly for the first time ever in their life. We get extremely fast results as the cognitive restructuring is quite literally done as they develop the new neural connections, reflecting an idealized version of themselves. There's a great depth of recovery as a result of this shift in identity. Again, it's complementary to the 12 steps, so there's not going to be pushback from people that already have had bad experiences with the spirituality in the past, and it keeps them from engaging in the 12 steps. You get 2-for-1 patients quite often. A lot of patients are in primary relationships, and it's important to work with both the primary patient and anybody who's in their inner circle, preferably at least the primary relationship, because when somebody goes through such a fundamental shift in personality, there's ultimately going to be some implications for those that are closest to them, and we can help navigate that as clinicians. This model resolves spiritual skepticism. There are ongoing aftercare opportunities, especially because it's a relatively new clinical model, especially as adapted for addiction. So if you choose to utilize this model, whether it's in individual sessions or with groups or in your treatment center, if you're the only one that's doing it for hundreds of miles, you're going to be in demand for aftercare. You can do it in person or remotely. You can do workshops. One nice thing about this clinical model is that all the methods for employing it are evidence-based, including the science, frankly. It's just connecting the dots with the science and our, utilizing CBT and rational emotive behavioral therapy, REBT. All these different techniques are evidence-based, and therefore our insurance isn't going to have a hard time reimbursing you if you have this stuff in your notes. And finally, it's semi-manualized. The book, Resolving Spiritual Skepticism and Recovery, serves as a primary text, and I'm in the process of developing a workbook, an accompanying workbook, to help people personalize the material to them specifically. Again, whether it's in a group, which creates a great forum of conversation, or individually. I'm not going to waste time with the spiritual tenets here. Maybe I will. I'll just read through them quickly. The universe is not static, but dynamic, possessing a consciousness. We ourselves and everything around us are expressions of the same unified field. The unified field is the mechanism by which we both commune with and receive feedback from the universe. All conscious beings are connected through the field. The unified field represents infinite possibilities at every single point in time. We each author our own realities, either consciously or unconsciously, selecting from an infinite number of possibilities at every moment. The higher the quality and greater the specificity and emotional content of our vision, the more specific and voluminous will be the universe's response. Our aspirations are future memories corresponding to an idealized state of being that exists in one potential reality, serving as a beacon toward which we may direct our energies. The universe wants us to be happy. It wants us to walk in a reality akin to our own definition of heaven on earth, where gratitude is the predominant emotion and in which our potential is fully realized. Living in our most authentic state in the present affords us the best opportunity to realize the reality to which we aspire, compressing the time between now and then. Thank you for your attention to this presentation. I hope you found it enticing, at least, and I hope that you will utilize my contact information below to reach out if you'd like me to come to your treatment center and do training for you and your clinicians. If you'd like me to present to your patients, if you're looking for step-down care, individual therapy for somebody that you think might be a good candidate for this type of clinical model, I'd be grateful if you reach out to me. My website, andrewgpierce.com. My cell number is listed right there. You can text me if you have any questions. I'm happy to talk to you. I'm on Mountain Time Zone right now, Salt Lake City. And you can email me at andrew@andrewgpierce.com. Again, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing from you.